I believed in the right moment. Not in a poetic way. In a practical one. I believed that life rewarded patience, that clarity arrived when you waited long enough, that rushing decisions was how people ruin things. I told myself I was careful. Thoughtful. Mature. I didn't realize I was confusing caution with postponement. The right moment became my favorite hiding place. Whenever something asked too much of me, courage, vulnerability, risk, I placed it gently into the future. Not because I didn't want it, but because I wanted it under better conditions. When I was more prepared. When things were calmer. When I knew more. Later felt responsible. Now felt reckless. So I waited. I waited to speak my truth because timing mattered. I waited to leave situations that drained me because it wasn't that bad yet. I waited to pursue things that mattered because I didn't feel ready to fail publicly. I told myself this was wisdom. Years passed. They passed quietly, without protest. My life didn't collapse around me. It organized itself. Routines formed. Expectations settled. People learned who I was, or at least, who I was willing to be. Someone dependable. Someone patient. Someone who didn't rush. Inside, I felt a constant hum of anticipation, like a train I was sure would arrive if I stood on the platform long enough. It never did. I remember a moment that should have changed everything. A conversation that opened a door just wide enough for me to step through. I felt the pull immediately. The excitement. The fear. And then the familiar calculation began. Is this the right time? What if I'm wrong? What if waiting a little longer makes it easier? I smiled. I nodded. I said, let me think about it. The door closed. Not dramatically. Politely. With no sound at all. At the time, I felt relief. I had avoided pressure. Avoided committing to something uncertain. I went home and slept well, convinced I had made the sensible choice. But the relief didn't last. It never does. A few weeks later, I felt a strange ache I couldn't explain. Not disappointment exactly. Something heavier. Like grief without an object. I tried to ignore it. Told myself opportunities come and go, that if it was meant for me, it would come back. That thought became another comfort. It's dangerous to believe life repeats itself on your schedule. I continued living as if everything important could be revisited. As if doors stayed open indefinitely. As if wanting something was the same as choosing it. I didn't see the pattern forming. Every meaningful decision was postponed in the name of timing. Every difficult conversation delayed until conditions improved. Every risk reframed as something I would take eventually. Eventually is a quiet word. It doesn't demand anything from you. It doesn't argue. It just waits while your life moves on. People around me changed. They moved forward, sideways, backward, at least they moved. They made mistakes. They corrected them. They learned things the hard way. I learned how to wait. From the outside, my life looked stable. Calm. Thought through. I had explanations for everything I hadn't done yet. I sounded reasonable even to myself. But inside, something was shrinking. My sense of urgency faded first. Then my sense of direction. Then, slowly, my ability to imagine a different future without feeling tired by the thought of it. I told myself that longing was childish. That adulthood meant managing desire, not indulging it. That life wasn't about passion, but about balance. What I didn't understand was that balance without movement is stagnation. One evening, alone, I tried to remember what I had been waiting for all these years. A sign? Confidence? Permission? The answer was uncomfortable. I was waiting to feel safe. Completely. Permanently. Without risk. And that feeling never comes. The right moment isn't something life hands you. It's something you create by stepping forward before certainty arrives. I learned that too late. The first real panic didn't come from failure. It came from realization. I looked at my life, not in crisis, not in ruins, and understood that it had been quietly passing without my participation. I hadn't chosen wrong. I had chosen later. And later had taken everything I meant to live. Once I saw it that way, everything shifted. Not externally. My life didn't suddenly change. My routine stayed the same. The days still arrived and left on schedule. But internally, a quiet panic began to spread. I had always believed I was in control because I wasn't making mistakes. Now I realized I wasn't making decisions either. And there's a difference. I started noticing how often I deferred my own life to an imagined future version of myself, someone braver, clearer, more decisive. That version was always just a little ahead of me, living under better circumstances, with fewer responsibilities, more confidence, more time. I kept waiting to become them. But time doesn't wait for upgrades. Moments began resurfacing in my mind, uninvited. Opportunities one had declined politely. Conversations I had postponed until they expired. People who had reached out while I was figuring things out and eventually stopped. None of them had ended badly. They had ended quietly. That's what hurt. There was no dramatic fallout I could grieve properly. No clear loss to mourn. Just a growing list of almosts that never turned into anything solid. Almost said yes. Almost left. Almost tried. Almost lived differently. I told myself I was being strategic. That every delay had a reason. But the truth was simpler and harder to face. I was afraid of committing to a version of my life that might fail. Waiting allowed me to preserve potential. As long as I hadn't tried, I hadn't failed. As long as I hadn't chosen, nothing could be taken away from me. Or so I thought. What I didn't see was that potential decays. It doesn't disappear all at once. It fades. It loses urgency. It becomes theoretical. Eventually, it stops feeling real. I began to feel tired in a way rest didn't fix. Not overwhelmed, just heavy. Days felt long and strangely flat. Even good news barely registered. I had built a life designed to avoid sharp edges, and in doing so, I had removed the texture. I started questioning my own reactions. Why didn't I feel excitement anymore? Why did decisions exhaust me before I even made them? Why did imagining change feel more draining than staying stuck? The answer frightened me. Because I had trained myself to wait. Waiting had become my default response to discomfort, uncertainty, and desire. Instead of engaging, I paused. Instead of choosing, I delayed. Instead of risking disappointment, I chose neutrality. Neutrality feels safe. But it also feels empty. I noticed how often I said things like, someday, and we'll see, and it's not the right time. Those phrases sounded reasonable. They kept conversations smooth. They required no follow-up. They also erased momentum. The longer I waited, the less capable I felt of acting. Decision-making muscles weaken when you don't use them. Courage doesn't grow in storage. One night, I sat alone and did something I had been avoiding for years. I looked at my life without explaining it. No justifications. No context. No future plans attached. Just the facts. I wasn't miserable. I wasn't fulfilled. I wasn't moving forward. And I wasn't moving away. I was suspended. That realization was unbearable. Because it meant I had mistaken stability for progress. I had assumed that as long as things weren't getting worse, they were acceptable. But life isn't measured by damage avoided. It's measured by presence. I began to understand that the right moment wasn't late. It was gone. Not because I missed one opportunity, but because I had turned waiting into a lifestyle. I had built my identity around being careful, and careful had slowly become stagnant. The most painful part wasn't regret. It was responsibility. No one had told me to wait this long. No one had forced me to postpone my life. I had chosen caution over and over again, convincing myself it was wisdom. And now, I was living inside the consequences. I wasn't angry at myself yet. I was disappointed. Disappointed in how little faith I had placed in my ability to adapt. In how much I underestimated my own resilience. In how I had assumed that safety was the highest goal a life could have. That disappointment marked a turning point. Because for the first time, waiting stopped feeling neutral. It started feeling like a loss I was actively choosing. Realizing that waiting was a loss didn't magically turn me into someone decisive. It turned me into someone aware. Awareness is uncomfortable. It strips away excuses and leaves you face to face with patterns you've spent years justifying. Once I saw how deeply I had built my life around postponement, I couldn't go back to believing I was simply being patient. Patience implies intention. What I had practiced was avoidance. The next step wasn't dramatic. I didn't quit everything or announce a new beginning. In fact, from the outside, very little changed at first. What changed was how I treated moments. When opportunities appeared, even small ones, I noticed my instinct to delay. That familiar tightening in my chest, the reflex to say, "Let me think about it," the comfort of deferring responsibility. This time, I paused. Not to wait, but to decide. I asked myself a different question than I ever had before. If I wait, what am I protecting? And if I act, what am I actually risking? The answer surprised me. I wasn't protecting my future. I was protecting my image of competence. I wasn't risking everything. I was risking discomfort. That distinction changed everything. I started choosing before certainty arrived. Before I felt ready. Before I had guarantees. The choices weren't always big. Sometimes they were just conversations I stopped postponing. Boundaries I finally named. Directions I committed to even though they scared me. Some of those choices worked out. Some didn't. But something unexpected happened. Even when I chose wrong, I didn't feel regret the way I used to. I felt engaged. I felt present. I felt like my life was responding to me instead of moving past me. The heavy disappointment I had lived with for so long began to loosen its grip. Not because I had fixed the past, but because I had stopped repeating it. I learned that regret isn't just about what you do. It's about the habits you carry forward. Waiting had been my habit. Choosing became my practice. I didn't reclaim all the time I lost. Some doors had closed permanently. Some relationships existed only in memory. Some versions of my life were no longer possible. That grief didn't disappear. But it stopped growing. And that was enough. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Urgency. Not panic. Not pressure. A quiet understanding that time was not an endless resource and that my life deserved participation, not preservation. The right moment, I realized, had never been about conditions. It was about courage. The courage to act without full information. To risk being wrong. To accept that certainty is not a prerequisite for meaning. I had waited for the right moment and missed years of my life doing so. Now, when hesitation rises, I don't ask whether the timing is perfect. I ask whether waiting will make the choice any more honest. Most of the time, it won't. I don't romanticize action. Acting can be messy. Painful. Disappointing. It can lead you down paths you wouldn't have chosen with hindsight. But waiting, when it becomes a way of life, leads you nowhere at all. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in it, the careful planning, the constant postponement, the belief that life will eventually signal when it's safe, I won't tell you to rush. I'll tell you something simpler. Don't let waiting replace living. I waited for the right moment. It never came. What came instead was the understanding that the moment only exists when you step into it. And choosing, imperfectly, prematurely, without guarantees, was the only way I ever truly entered my own life.